What would you do if the man who had once grabbed your collar in a hospital room suddenly appeared at your kitchen door, carrying fish, vegetables, and a shame so heavy it looked as if one wrong word might send him turning back into the road? He had not come alone. Beside him stood the wife whose life Jack and Tu Tien had helped save, her face still pale from weakness, her hands full of baskets, her eyes lowered with the kind of embarrassment that comes when gratitude arrives late and must pass through the ruins of misunderstanding first. Inside the little wooden kitchen, the afternoon light was gentle, the stove still cold, the table still empty. Yet before a single pot was set on the fire, the room was already crowded with emotion. Nam's remorse, his wife's fragile thankfulness, Tu Tien's instinctive kindness, and Jack's quiet uncertainty about whether a wound caused by mistrust could really be softened by one sincere visit. The gifts they brought were simple fresh vegetables, countryside herbs, a silver-scaled fish, a few honest things gathered from rural life. But the true offering was harder to carry. It was Nam's lowered pride. It was his wife's wish to make peace not with words alone, but with presence. And before the evening ended, this cramped kitchen would become something no one had expected. A place where apology would turn into cooperation, where status would loosen its grip, where two women would speak of burdens usually hidden behind smiles, and where a CEO in a dress shirt would stand shoulder to shoulder with a working man at the stove, learning that the warmest things in life are often made only after humiliation has been endured and forgiven. The afternoon had begun quietly enough. Tu Tien was in the kitchen when the knock came, moving between familiar tasks with the gentle efficiency of a woman who had learned to make peace from ordinary things. The old wooden window frames let in soft strips of golden light. A thin breeze moved through the room, carrying the smell of dried herbs and clean rice. It should have been one of those peaceful village afternoons that pass without demanding too much from anyone. But peace, in their lives lately, had become something delicate, something that often vanished just when it seemed safe to trust. She heard the voices first, a man's voice, hesitant, a woman's voice, softer, almost whispering, then the scrape of baskets being adjusted against tired hands. Tu Tien stepped toward the doorway, wiped her fingers against her apron, and opened the door. Nam stood there. For one small, dangerous second, the old scene from the hospital flashed through the air between them, as clearly as if it had happened that morning, the rage in his face, the accusation in his voice, the violence that had almost turned kindness into disaster. But the man at the door was not the same man who had stormed into that hospital room like a wounded animal. His shoulders were lower, his eyes did not burn, his jaw was no longer rigid with suspicion. What remained on his face now was harder to look at, the full, unprotected weight of remorse. Beside him stood his wife. She held one side of a basket, though Nam was clearly trying to carry most of the load himself. Her face was still thinner than health should allow. There was weakness in the way she stood, but also determination. She had dressed neatly for the visit, not in vanity, but in respect. They had not come to complete some formal duty. They had come because gratitude had become too heavy to keep postponing. The baskets were full, fresh green vegetables with roots still damp from soil, bundles of herbs tied in rough string, a fish, clean and bright, its silver scales catching the sunlight. Everything about those gifts spoke the same language. This is not expensive, but it is sincere. This is not polished, but it is from our hands. This is what people with little money and honest hearts bring when they want to say, "We have no elegant way to repay you, but please let us try." Nam tried to speak first and failed. His throat worked around the words, but they did not come easily. Tu Tien saw that and did the kindest thing she could have done. She smiled and stepped aside before forcing him through the pain of an immediate explanation. She welcomed them in as if their presence, not their apology, mattered most. That single gesture loosened something in the room at once. Jack, hearing voices, appeared from the inner room. He stopped when he saw who stood in the doorway. The pause was brief, but meaningful. No one in that kitchen could pretend the past did not exist. No one could erase the memory of Nam's hand at Jack's collar or the police station where truth had finally crushed rage into shame. Yet Jack's face did not harden. It did not warm immediately either. What settled over his expression was something deeper, careful openness, the kind given by a man who has suffered enough to understand how difficult it is for another man to return after being wrong. Nam lowered his head. The first words came out broken. He said they had come to apologize properly. Not at the police station, where the air was too official and the shame too public. Not with hurried words spoken under fluorescent light and procedural pressure. But here, in front of the people they had wronged, with both hands visible and hearts stripped of pride, his wife stepped forward then. Her voice shook, but it carried truth more steadily than his. She said that if Jack and Tu Tien had not stopped that day, if they had driven past like everyone else, she did not know what might have happened to her. She said she could still remember, through the blur of unconsciousness, a woman's voice speaking gently and a pair of hands supporting her. She looked at Tu Tien when she said that, and Tu Tien's eyes softened immediately. The baskets were placed on the table. That act seemed simple, but it changed the room. The gifts became a visible sign that these two had not come only to empty their guilt. They had come to build something after it, to show, through effort and humility, that remorse can become relationship if it is handled with sincerity. The kitchen shifted. At first, the conversation moved awkwardly, with pauses too long and smiles that arrived late. But warmth enters spaces like that through action, faster than speech. Tu Tien began unpacking the vegetables. Nam's wife stepped forward to help without waiting to be asked. She knew that if she sat passively like a guest, the apology would remain incomplete. So, she washed greens, separated herbs, trimmed stems, and wiped the fish clean again even though it had already been cleaned at home. Her hands moved slowly from weakness at first, then with more confidence as the rhythm of work gave her somewhere safe to put her feelings. Tu Tien sat beside her at the low table for part of it. Their conversation began with practical things, how strong she felt now, whether the dizziness had passed, whether she had been sleeping. But women in small kitchens do not stay at the level of surface talk for long when the room is honest enough. Soon they were speaking more deeply. About overwork, about family pressure, about what it means to keep going when every day seems to ask for more than the body can give. Nam's wife confessed that she had been pushing herself too hard for too long before the accident. She had told herself she had no right to rest because there was always one more bill, one more burden, one more need in the house. Tu Tien listened the way only someone acquainted with silent hardship can listen. She did not interrupt with false reassurance. She did not offer easy philosophy. She nodded, asked quiet questions, and from time to time touched the other woman's wrist or handed her another bundle of vegetables to trim, as if solidarity could move through practical objects. She spoke, too, of her own life, not as complaint, but as truth, of the market, of trying to support Jack in whatever small ways she could, of learning not to fear work even when the work was hard and the future unstable. The two women did not become intimate in some dramatic instant, but a bridge formed there, piece by piece, over shared labor and unguarded honesty. Across the room, another kind of transformation had begun. Jack was still wearing the remains of his workday. His shirt was fine. His vest still sat properly against him. His sleeves were buttoned. He looked like a man who belonged in meetings, contracts, and formal spaces, not in the heat of a village kitchen preparing an evening meal out of fish and greens. Nam seemed to notice that difference too, and perhaps that made him hesitate. Then Jack did something that surprised everyone, including himself a little. He unbuttoned his vest, folded it carefully, set it aside. Then he rolled up his sleeves, It was a small act, but in that kitchen it felt like a decision. He stepped toward the table and asked what needed to be done. For a second, Nam simply stared. He had once known Jack only as the man he had accused, the man who remained impossibly calm under insult, the man whose social position seemed to belong to another world entirely. Now that same man stood there asking how to help clean vegetables like anyone else. Nam gave him a bunch of greens. Jack took them. The first few minutes were awkward enough to make everyone smile. Jack held the knife incorrectly. He trimmed too close on one root and not close enough on another. He washed more slowly than necessary, as if trying to avoid ruining produce that had been grown, gathered, and brought with sincerity. Nam, despite everything, found himself quietly instructing him, not mocking, not over-explaining, just guiding, the way one man helps another through an unfamiliar task. It was the first time since the hospital that they stood beside each other without tension between them. The kitchen came alive. Water ran. Knives tapped wood. The fish was cut for braising. Vegetables went into bowls. Rice was rinsed. Steam began to rise from the stove. The earlier embarrassment did not disappear, but it dissolved into movement, and movement is often what healing needs most. The room no longer belonged to apology alone. It belonged to cooperation. At the stove, Jack and Nam worked together. Nam showed him how much oil was enough, when to lower the heat, how long to let the fish sit before turning it. Jack listened seriously. No trace of corporate authority entered his face. He did not behave like a man humoring rural simplicity for one evening. He behaved like someone realizing he had much to learn from the ordinary competence of lives different from his own. The fish began to braise. The smell changed the emotional weather of the room. Soy, fish, pepper, shallot, and heat created that unmistakable fragrance of home cooking, the kind of smell that makes silence kinder and sorrow easier to bear. Beside it, greens boiled gently, retaining their freshness, their color, their plain goodness. Tu Tien and Nam's wife set bowls and chopsticks on the table while continuing to talk in low voices. Jack glanced at them once and saw something that moved him unexpectedly. The woman they had rescued and Tu Tien sat close now, no longer divided by crisis. Their heads leaned toward one another in the old posture of feminine trust. He had spent so much of his life moving through masculine environments where tension is expressed openly and repaired clumsily. Watching the two women build understanding through care, food, and listening reminded him that some of life's strongest repairs are made in gentler ways. By the time the dishes were ready, the room no longer felt cramped. The table was modest, the food was rustic. Nothing about the setting would have impressed the world Jack once moved through, but when they sat down together, something more valuable than elegance settled over them. They began eating with the tentative politeness of people not yet sure how much laughter they are allowed. Then someone made a small remark about Jack's awkward vegetable cutting. Nam, to everyone's surprise, smiled. Jack accepted the joke. Tu Tien laughed. Nam's wife covered her mouth as laughter escaped her too. That first shared laughter did more than any apology could have done. After that, the meal opened. Stories were told. Not the polished stories people offer at formal tables, but the real ones. Nam spoke of hard work, of financial pressure, of how fear had made him a man he was ashamed to remember. Jack did not stop him. He listened. Then he spoke of his own difficulties, not in grand detail, but enough to make clear that titles do not protect men from exhaustion, debt, or helplessness. Tu Tien and Nam's wife exchanged looks when they heard it, the kind of look women share when they recognize that men often hide collapse under silence until life finally forces it into the open. Food moved from plate to plate. Fish was offered, vegetables divided, bowls refilled, chopsticks reaching across boundaries that had only recently been walls. No one mentioned status anymore. It had become irrelevant under the yellow kitchen light. Jack was no longer the CEO in that moment. Nam was no longer the man who attacked him. Tu Tien was no longer the anxious witness from the hospital corridor. Nam's wife was no longer only the unconscious stranger from the roadside. They were simply four tired people eating together after having seen too much of one another's weakness to keep pretending. As the meal neared its end, the mood changed again, but this time into something quieter and deeper. The laughter softened, the room settled, full stomachs and honest conversation left behind a gentle stillness. Nam looked at Jack with a different kind of courage now, not the reckless courage of anger, but the vulnerable courage of a man asking to be seen accurately after having shown his worst side. He thanked him again, more simply this time. Jack nodded once. That was enough. Then Jack looked around the table. The old wooden kitchen, the low light, the simple food, the women sitting beside each other like sisters after a single difficult day had remade them. Nam no longer guarded, no longer inflamed. He felt a truth rise in him with a force that surprised him. Peace like this could not be bought, not by status, not by contracts, not by all the things he had once chased believing they would secure life. This shared food after pain, forgiveness without humiliation, sincerity that asks for nothing grand in return, this was the wealth people spend entire lives missing. When they finally stood to clear the table, the distance between them was gone. Not erased cheaply, earned away. The apology had not remained an isolated event. It had become an evening of work, listening, cooking, and eating together. That was why it mattered. Because reconciliation that stays only in words is fragile. Reconciliation that passes through hands, heat, and shared labor sinks deeper. Nam and his wife prepared to leave. The baskets were lighter now, the table emptier, the room quieter, but something fuller remained behind. At the doorway, Nam hesitated once more. Not from shame this time, from gratitude too large for polished language. He thanked both Jack and Tu Tien again. His wife held Tu Tien's hand a little longer than necessary, and in that touch there was a promise that the bond formed that evening would not end with the last dish washed. When the door closed behind them, the kitchen seemed to exhale. Tu Tien turned back toward the table and began gathering the bowls, but Jack stopped for a moment and simply looked around. The room was the same. Yet it had become witness to something rare, a day when human sincerity proved stronger than humiliation, when a misunderstanding did not calcify into bitterness, when a man who could have held power chose humility instead, and when the simplest meal became the place where four lives quietly changed direction. And perhaps that was the true lesson of the evening. Friendship does not always begin with admiration. Sometimes it begins with injury, shame, and the painful exposure of human weakness. But when people choose honesty after that, and kindness is answered with effort instead of excuses, even a small countryside kitchen can become holy in its own humble way. Under that old roof, with braised fish and boiled greens still fragrant in the air, Jack saw more clearly than ever that peace is not the absence of hardship. It is the moment hardship fails to make people cruel.